Um, Welcome to the webinar on pairing nuclear with maritime. And I'm Doreen Abisundra, and I run Fresco Clean Tech Solutions as an independent financial consultant, very much structuring and securing financing for AI infrastructure, modular reactors in particular, and the idea of decarbonization. So this concept of maritime plus modular reactors fits very well into that remit. Why this webinar? Well, a couple of reasons. There's a buzzword all around data centers, new nuclear, but what we need to also realize is that there's a new spot for nuclear in maritime for broader senses. We're going to explain how and why that's needed. Just one quick fun fact is that the maritime trade is responsible for up to 3% of global greenhouse gases. And a note that I picked up was that if we aggregate from the maritime sector as a country, that would be the 6th largest country by emissions. So this is a very crucial sector that needs decarbonization. But let's get stuck into meet our panelist. I'm going to start first with Ricardo. Tell us a little bit of who you are and what you do.
Hi, Doreen. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ricardo Batista. I work in the Maritime Safety Division at the International Maritime Organization. I'm a naval architect and marine engineer, and I've been getting experience over the last 15 years on sustainable energy systems for ships in a context both of decarbonization, but also development of the relevant safety framework.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And let's do the two Marks, starting with Mark Tipping and Mark Smith, and then to Humina.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Doreen. I started my career a long time ago on refrigerated cargo ships as a marine engineer, then moved into the advanced process industries, finally ending up in marine classification, working on some of the world's largest and most complex offshore projects, which gave me the opportunity to learn what it means to integrate complex technology and actually work in environments where regulation has not yet caught up with the job to be done. And I think that's very much where we find ourselves with nuclear today. Hence why I have been in this place now with floating nuclear for around 10 years, with a huge amount of activity really over the last 3, with a lot of public attention in the last 18 months.
Fantastic. Thank you. Mark Smith.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity here to speak. My name is Mark Smith. My background is marine engineer, like Mark Tipping also, but predominantly on container vessels. I then moved into technical management, a technical superintendent and a fleet superintendent, managing up to 20 container vessels at any one time. And then I moved over to North Standard, formerly North, but prior to the merger, where I took an interest in fuel technologies, loss prevention, and that then spiraled into decarbonization and helped us now to work with our members to manage the risk internally and to guide our members on the alternative fuels and technologies ahead. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Humina.
Yes, hello, everybody. So I'm a lawyer. I've been working in the nuclear sector for more than 20 years. I'm specialized in nuclear law with a special focus on nuclear liability, which is a special regime that applies in the nuclear sector. And I'm very involved with the floating nuclear power plants issue, as I'm chairing several groups that are addressing this type of new installations, and everybody is very excited to know how we're going to be able to deploy them everywhere.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Now we've met each of our speakers, and obviously for everyone, this is an opportunity to learn from people who are kind of actively in the market. And I suppose each one of our speakers is an inspiration as well. So now what I want to do is to get each of our speakers to talk about what their company does, specifically in terms of the technology that is related to maritime and obviously to nuclear. So let's start with you, Ricardo. Now, The panel and I are familiar with technology innovators in this sector. We've seen kind of maritime nuclear applications operating in the past, but being discussed for the future. So tell us a little bit about what is the International Maritime Organization, what is its general rulemaking process, and then there's this acronym called SOLAS. Tell us what does SOLAS stand for, what's its relevance to maritime, and if you can talk a little bit about the nuclear code to which SOLAS is linked, please.
Thank you, Doreen. I hope you have 2 hours for me to speak about IMO history, and I'll just try to put that into a few minutes. So IMO, International Maritime Organization, is an agency of the United Nations based in London. It is composed of 176 member states and 3 associate members, plus 67 international intergovernmental organizations, and plus 88 non-governmental organizations. So it's composed of a significant number of members. As a footnote, NEMO, on which some of you, notably Mark Tipping, are involved, have recently joined as an NGO to IMO. So nuclear coming also with membership, participating in IMO discussions and decision making. At IMO, nuclear is a topic that is already incorporated in the regulatory framework, both with respect to propulsion of commercial ships, but also with respect to transport. With respect to propulsion, SOLAS, on which I will outline a bit what SOLAS is about, but SOLAS includes 1 chapter dedicated to nuclear propulsion. This chapter basically outlines that flag states need to certify ships using nuclear propulsion to meet nuclear safety standards, and is remarkably focused on protection against radiation emission, and is highly focused on a specific technology. And associated to this SOLAS chapter, chapter 8, there is a non-mandatory code entitled the Nuclear Code, which is focused on regulating ships using nuclear propulsion. It is a design-specific code, a code that is designed for a specific technology of 40 years ago. So the code is already quite aged, and we will come to that, I'm sure, in the next items for discussion. But we include also in the framework transportation of nuclear cargo, and this is in the context of the IMDG code for transportation of dangerous goods, and in the INF code for safe carriage of packaged irradiated nuclear fuel, plutonium, and high-level radioactive waste on board ships. So there is already a comprehensive framework on which we have to focus on a way to adapt to the new challenges and new technologies. SOLAS as a whole is a convention for safety of life at sea. It includes, of course, a holistic coverage of different safety topics in shipping, covering different ship types and different applications. It is a convention, and amending the convention involves a specific process. Its codes also involve a specific process for amendment or for development. As regards the process to develop such amendments, there is in short 3 phases. One phase where the need is identified, either through a gap analysis, risk assessments, identification of a need with industry stakeholders. This identification of a need is remarkably technical, but also political. There is a second stage where, following the identification of the need, there is the voting and the decision making to have this work item in the agenda for IMO. So there is a need to vote for this to be a topic to be worked in. And then following this, on a third stage, there is the actual work development. And allow me, Doreen, just to focus a bit on how the work is then progressed. In June, we had the Maritime Safety Committee agreeing to include the revision of the nuclear code in the IMO agenda for the work, in particular in the subcommittee on ship design and construction. This subcommittee meets once a year, so the work can progress as much as possible in these yearly meetings, but of course this wouldn't be enough. And there is intersessional work that typically takes place with established correspondence group works. And also, if there is a need identified, to have intersessional working groups that take place also physically at IMO. During this work, member states and organizations, they devote their best technical resources to discuss and to contribute to the development of the work. IMO provides all the assistance in terms of secretariat, technical support, and keeping up the pace in the agenda. But I have to say, notably, the work is in the hands of member states and organizations. It goes as fast as the proposals are put on the table. It goes as fast as consensus are reached, and synergies are also developed between member states and organizations. And we can have a work that can take 2 to 3 years or more, depending on how these different factors are combined. What we have witnessed as IMO Secretariat is there is, from different sides, willingness to cooperate and collaborate in this revision of the nuclear code, because there is a linkage with the greenhouse gas net zero framework and the reduction of CO2 emissions.
Brilliant. That's fantastic oversight into SOLAS, the IMO, the nuclear code, and the fact that as of June, things are changing and there's been agreement to it. Let's move now on to Mark Tipping. I suppose here, Mark, many of us are not often fully cognizant of the workings of something called the Lloyd's Register. So tell us a little bit about what the company does, how it's best described, what is its link to maritime, and the importance of classification and certification in particular when it comes to the changing of regulations.
Thank you. Well, classification is something that's familiar to anyone who works in the maritime industry, but bringing maritime and nuclear together means a great number of people are not. So for those that are, please bear with me whilst I describe it. And I'll just throw out some key words to start with. Third-party assurance, proxy regulation, independent, international, and working under the authority of flag states. So what does that mean? Lloyd's Register has been around for around 250 years and is one of a number of companies which are described as classification societies. In essence, we are proxy regulators that write rules and regulations that sit underneath SOLAS, which Ricardo has just described. So what in essence we do is we provide the detail for the design, construction, and verification of condition of an asset throughout its life. And we do that on an international basis in just about every corner of the world, along with our competitors in this space. And I'll go back to that phrase, proxy regulator, again. We are independent organizations that are non-governmental, so we act independently. But every ship in the world that transits internationally is flagged to a specific nation. And in classification, for us to actually do our job, we need to be able to act on behalf of a nation state. So we have a delegated responsibility to us to act on their behalf, which ties together the work that we do in defining the rules and regulations that sit under SOLAS to actually sitting under a national body that actually provides the ultimate accountability for that ship. Now, in doing all of this, we provide a service which says, is a ship good enough to be on the oceans or not? And this will lead into what Mark Smith will talk about is, as in most cases, having a classification certificate, which is our final product, is a requirement of insurance. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Doreen, and
Brilliant.
maybe there's something that comes back with Mark and myself.
Fantastic, and that's a brilliant tie-in to Mark Smith from North Standard. Mark, your company describes itself, I did a little bit of homework on you, as one of the largest P&I clubs in the international group. So tell us firstly, what is North Standard? What is the P&I club and the international group? And what exactly you do, and what's your link to maritime?
Okay, thank you. North Standard is one of the leading providers of global marine insurance across the industry and the maritime industry. The mutual pool tonnage alone surpasses 270 million gross tons. And from our headquarters in the UK and satellite offices around the world, we represent a large proportion of marine insured tonnage. We form part, there's 12 P&I clubs. It's similar in stance to North Standard, although varying sizes, and that covers 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage. So 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage is covered by P&I clubs, and we're one of those 12s. And we insure liabilities arising, third-party liabilities, of 20% of the IG tonnage. Therefore, our approximate coverage is 18% of the ocean-going tonnage. So what this enables us to do is to give a very holistic overview of the marine industry and the risks involved based on what we experience from claims, but also our close relationships with our members. The difference with Mutual being is that it's a long-served relationship. A lot of our work is based on relationships. We get feedback from our members, and we also provide a service to our members. At North Standard, we like to position ourselves where we are wishing to adopt technology and the quest for zero carbon technologies, whilst recognizing the risk and guiding the industry along that journey. It's very important to note that we're fuel agnostic as such. However, we do recognize that nuclear is a zero carbon option. As part of this, the push to help our members and to guide the industry on nuclear, North Standard co-authored a white paper with Lloyd Register. Mark Tipping was involved with that, and Core Power, and that was launched in UK Parliament earlier this year. North Standard sits on all working groups, which were cited before by Mark Tipping. That's NEMO working groups. NEMO stands for the Nuclear Energy Maritime Organization. And I'm lucky enough to head up one of those task force, which is tasked to develop STCW training standards. And what we're doing there is we're looking at what's across the globe on an international basis, what's available in each country, and how we could develop that going forward. We all need to be very cognizant that we need to train people for this technology, train crew. That's one of the very important things we need to consider, but we don't have the technology there to train them. So we need to look at this in a modular manner. We need to look at the different stages of training which are required, and we need to develop that accordingly with the industry, with safety at the forefront of every decision that is made. So thank you. That's just a brief overview of what we do.
Thank you. At 90% coverage, you're certainly being kept busy, aren't you? Now, Hamina, last but not least, because this is a really important part of due diligence when it comes to moving things along. You're from a global law firm. Again, a bit of homework. White & Case describes itself as thinking on behalf of our clients to help them achieve their ambitions. So you've got your work cut out for us here, Hamina. Tell us a little bit about what White & Case does, explain how, why, and to whom a law firm is relevant in the pairing of nuclear with ship propulsion, as well as a phrase that we're going to talk about soon, floating nuclear power plants.
So in fact, White & Case has been advising clients from the two sectors. So from one side, the nuclear sector with regards to reactors and any other kinds of nuclear installations. So all kinds of services from the operation or disputes or financing of these nuclear installations. And on the other side, we also have the shipping and maritime industry support, where we, in fact, we help our clients with the challenges, that come across the jurisdictions in this sector, and our team guides clients through critical matters from capital raising and M&A to compliance disputes and financial restructuring. So what is interesting is now with these projects, both worlds are colliding. So from my part, from the nuclear practice, we're very active in different groups. So I know NEMO, but we are also the International Nuclear Law Association, and also I'm chairing a group of the EU Industry Alliance for SMRs, where we're also addressing floating nuclear power plants. And so we are trying to see how we can have a legal framework that can be applicable to the future of civil propulsion. So we might talk about this later on during this webinar. So what is interesting is at this moment, we're all discussing about how to improve the legal framework, and it's a work that we need to do all together and with our clients.
Fantastic, thank you for that. At this point in time, I want to talk about the FNPP, which we just briefly touched on. So this May, the 24th edition of the International Project on Innovative Nuclear Reactors and Fuel Cycles, INPRO, that's the acronym, had a dialogue forum which brought together 64 experts, 24 countries for in-depth discussions on what is needed to facilitate the deployment of, including how to overcome regulatory and other challenge. And then another so-called fun fact is in November 2023, the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, held a symposium on FNPPs, floating nuclear power plants, with legal experts to again talk about the role that FNPPs could play in the fight against climate change and the transition to net zero, which Ricardo, you've briefly touched upon. So clearly FNPP is a known technology. Here now we're going to go to each of the panelists to find out a little bit more about it. So Ricardo, we've heard a snippet of what INPRO and IAEA's links are to FNPP. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the IMO is doing in terms of considering floating nuclear power plants?
Of course, floating nuclear power plants were also considered by the Maritime Safety Committee in June, as there was a proposal to include consideration of these FNPPs in the context of the revision of the nuclear code. However, the decision of the committee was to separate the work streams, the work on the revision of the nuclear code to advance already in January next year, and the work on FNPPs to require a request for a new output. It was consideration of the committee to have to invite interested member states and organizations to put forward a specific proposal for a new output. We may argue similarities between installations or safety systems on what would be a floating platform or a ship, but ships are covered in SOLAS, floating platforms are not. There would be the need for development of a specific instrument that could address that. As a note of optimism, I believe that there is likelihood that with this new output and the ongoing work on revision of the code, the synergies between the two identified needs will come together to the same group working on these provisions. And we may be talking about different instruments that in the end may fall in the same group, given the similarities of these systems. Cooperation with the IAEA as our sister agency is key. So there is work to do together in order to not only for the revision of the nuclear code, but also for the future consideration of FNPPs, which we believe sooner or later will also land in IMO to further develop provisions for these FNPPs.
Right, really interesting. And I suppose now it really is the question to Mark Tipping. How does one classify or even certify an FNPP? You know, are there considerations for developers of this technology?
I think the most interesting element here is precedent when we're thinking about FNPPs. And it's important to note that they're not hypothetical. The Russians are already deploying floating nuclear power plants. And in fact, the United States deployed them in the 1970s as well. So this is something where we do have some tangible experience, and the regulations needs to catch up a bit on that. And it's very important that we do have standards at IMO for floating nuclear power plants. But unlike ships, and ships need to conduct international voyages, floating nuclear power plants are stationary and generally stay in one place for a very long time. They might move ultimately, but it's a simpler process. They'll move once or twice. It's not a regular occurrence for them. So it means we can also look to the precedents that have been set in the offshore industry for oil and gas, again, as to how some of those facilities have been regulated already. And they're equally complex to nuclear power plants. They also have their own safety challenges as well. So we're not talking about something which is hugely different in terms of complexity. So we foresee that it might be that the very first floating nuclear power plants that we see in places outside of Russia actually take advantage of existing national regulation within a country's borders. And that's not too difficult to do because you don't have the international transit aspect to it, so that you can work up a bespoke regulatory requirement for the first FNPPs to operate in a discrete area. And as I say, we've seen the precedent for that already in the offshore industry and for similar applications. So from talking to some of the national regulators and nuclear regulators around the world, some of them are actually quite comfortable if a project comes along today and says, we would like to do this. So for us, we actually see the floating nuclear power plant as perhaps the largest of the first movers in the floating environment. And I'll wrap up in a moment or two, but I just want to leave it with another element here. We've used the word floating. We don't need to just consider floating applications in the marine environment. The offshore oil and gas industry has done a lot of work, and there are hundreds of what we call fixed platforms. The same thing can happen with nuclear as well. It might be fixed, it might be floating. We can consider both.
Fundamentally important points that you make there, Mark, because you're right. I mean, effectively, we're talking onshore, offshore, and having been in project financing where we've looked at, you're right, the offshore rigs, but the floating offshore wind farms that have been more recently financed, along with the so-called fixed bottom offshore wind farms and the FSPOs that have been financed. All of that have been so-called bankable. And so it's just about bringing the various different parties together. And I know from being in the financing community, we need our legal advisor to help us along with that financing agreement. So Hermina, it's your turn now to help us understand what the nuclear community is doing to, say, address the FNPPs and whether they are deemed as nuclear installations. And, you know, if you can just share some of your thoughts on the deliverability, cost, financing sources, and legal considerations.
It's very interesting because in the nuclear world, it's true that, as Mark was saying, I mean, there have been floating nuclear power plants in the past, but not many. And in fact, there was an intent of regulating them. For example, there was a convention, the Brussels Conventions of 1962 on the liability of the operators for nuclear ships that was adopted, but never entered into force. One of the many reasons why it didn't enter into force is because it covered not only civil but also military ships. So therefore, but the idea here, as you know, especially everybody, not only the financial institutions, but everybody wants to know about the risk allocation, what happens. And when you say nuclear, unfortunately still, even though we do have a good track record, people are scared. And so they want to know what is going to happen if there is a nuclear accident, who is going to be liable? And also who is going to be responsible to ensure the safety, the security of reactors, of nuclear reactors. So here the specificity is that the reactors are not on land, they are floating. And so we are working around our nuclear conventions because some of them, in fact, unfortunately don't apply and explicitly excluded, in fact, floating nuclear power plants. Because, for example, the nuclear liability part, as this convention, the Brussels Convention, was supposed to be adopted. So all international nuclear liability conventions that deal with nuclear damage, so it means damage caused by ionizing radiation, exclude reactors for propulsion. And so therefore, for the floating nuclear power plants, as it's not going to, it's the floating nuclear power plants, it's, let's say, a weird animal for us because it's not really for propulsion and it's going to generate power. So we consider, legal experts have considered that once the floating nuclear power plant is generating power, which means that it's ashore, it can be considered a nuclear installation from a nuclear liability perspective. And therefore, the nuclear liability regime should apply of the country in the waters where, in fact, this ship is based would apply. But the problem is that we have the nuclear safety conventions that clearly only applies to onshore nuclear reactors. So who is going to be supervising the safety of this installation? Do we consider it a nuclear installation from a safety perspective? So those are discussions that we are currently having. The problem with regard to nuclear liability, which one of the important ones, because it also addresses insurance, as Mark Smith was discussing about insurance, is that, well, if we could potentially consider that floating nuclear power plants are covered by this nuclear liability convention, we could, I mean, there is a specific type of insurance that would apply that is provided for the nuclear insurance pools, but then we will have to see how that's going to work with the regular, in fact, insurance that you have to have with regards to any type of ship. So it's pretty complex. There are discussions going on. I might not be able to get into all the details, as Ricardo was saying. I mean, I could speak for the whole day about this, but maybe that could give already a glimpse of the complexity here about whether a nuclear installation, I mean, a floating nuclear power plant is or not considered a nuclear installation in our world. And also the need for, again, I stress the need of the financial institutions to have clear visibility on the risk allocation, and so who is going to be liable and who is going to be supervised.
Thank you. That's excellent. And you're right. There's just so much to say. So the purpose of this webinar is to effectively whet the appetite of the audience, and so we can go into further details with each of the panelists separately. And perhaps I should mention, you know, when we were talking about maritime, the audience might be wondering why have we just gone straight to FNPPs? Because there are two things, obviously. First is ship propulsion. So what we're talking is about changing the engines or changing the fuel that will propel or that will move the ships from diesel or other fossil bases into nuclear. And then this is the additional angle which is linked to maritime. And dare I say also there's the third section, which is the near-shore infrastructure, which we'll need to address at a separate occasion. So, Ricardo, you briefly touched upon the excitement of what's coming up, rule changes. And I recall reading the first SOLAS document, not when it was issued, because that was back in the 80s, but it goes that far back. But we're starting to see change. So perhaps tell us a little bit more, you know, on a very high level, what exactly is happening at the IMO in terms of its plans to change the nuclear code, How does the IMO collaborate with your sister company, the IAEA? And there's also the acronym ATLAS, the Atomic Technology License for Application at Sea. So I know quite a bit thrown at you, but just high level, what is changing?
So again, questions for a whole day, but I will try to be very synthetic. The need to change the more than 40-year-old nuclear code at IMO has been the outcome of the identification of gaps and barriers to the uptake of greenhouse gas mitigation technology. So as part of alternative fuels, different technologies, a group of experts identified that with a view to allow progress of nuclear as a propulsion for ships as a mitigation technology for greenhouse gas emissions, the nuclear code would have to be revised. So following this identification, the Maritime Safety Committee has allocated this task to the Ship Design and Construction Subcommittee, and here the work is intended to progress as from January next year. The revision of the code, of course, is not an initiative of IMO, is an initiative of the member states and organizations. So this needs to be based on proposals. And there are deadlines to submit these proposals before the meetings actually take place. So 17th of October this year is the deadline for submitting proposals to put on the table at SDC 12. A work plan is expected to be the first task, as indicated by the committee in June. So we need to develop a work plan that incorporates all the technologies that SDC is intended to work with. And for nuclear, the same. The work plan will have to outline what is intended to do in the couple of years ahead. There is an opportunity to develop a technology agnostic global-based code in a different fashion of the existing nuclear code, which is highly technology specific. So the technology that was the top technology 40 years ago, today technology advanced significantly, and there is a need to not to develop a design code, but to develop a performance code, a code that is based on the expected safety performance of nuclear powered ships. And this goal-based formulation is already today in IMO used in different instruments, and leaving to the class societies, what Mark Tipping already explained quite well, leaving to class societies and international standardization, the role of then identifying the standards for safe design in specific systems. Cooperation with IAEA, as you mentioned, is a key success factor for this work. I mean, the ownership of nuclear safety for installations, but also for reactors to be installed on board ships is from IAEA. We will have to cooperate very closely with our sister agency. And the ATLAS initiative is an essential building block for the revision of the nuclear code. Through ATLAS, we expect input into the revision of the nuclear code. We expect this to be an accelerator, a catalyzer for the revision of the code, but also for other instruments that need to be revised, notably related to ports, for acceptance of nuclear ships into ports, for liability, as well as Amina already mentioned. So there is a constellation of instruments that need to be updated with a view to allow for operation, for design and safe operation of nuclear powered ships. Currently, the nuclear code is non-mandatory. This is expected to be also an element to be discussed as part of the further development and revision of the code, but we expect this work to follow from proposals from member states and organizations. So at IMO, we basically facilitate, support, provide the necessary conditions for all our members to be able to work collaboratively and advance on what has been identified as needs for the regulatory framework.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And that must be a challenge given the number of countries with different opinions as well, bringing them all together. I'll go to Mark Smith now. Mark, surely the crux of delivering on the ambitions that have been set up by Ricardo here in terms of rule changes, have an impact on insurance and the availability of insurance. If you can tell us, please, what are the biggest challenges ahead for ensuring liabilities that arise from these changes in nuclear technologies, and how does North Standard and other similar companies and the IG prepare for this?
Okay, it's a good question, and I'll try my best to answer it. Current liabilities caused by or arising from ionizing radiation from or contamination by radioactivity or any nuclear fuel or the combustion of nuclear fuel are excluded from the IG Club's pooling agreement. As we've said before, I could spend all day talking about the pooling agreement, but effectively any claim above 10 million US dollars is shared amongst other IG clubs within the IG group. So that's what the pooling agreement is. However, we recognize that the technology has developed and nuclear is a true net zero option. So an advanced modular reactors as well are differ from PWR, that's pressurized water technology for those that are not familiar, seen on naval submarines. And this means that there's a smaller emergency planning zone, and that is quite critical in how that is taken on board from a P&I club and a liability regime. So the emergency planning zone will be closer to the confines of the ships. However, ourselves and our reinsurers, which is an important point to bring across, still need to gain an understanding of the risk as technology develops. What have we done to try and help with this? The IG, the international group, as we spoke about before, has set up a committee whose main objective is to determine whether liabilities in connection to nuclear as a fuel should become poolable. That's a very important decision, obviously. As it reaches that particular value, that particular ceiling, will it be poolable? And the very important point to bring to this, and probably just to finish off what I want to say here, I don't want to leave a bad taste in anybody's mouth, but without a limitation of liability framework for nuclear vessels, the cost of insurance or reinsurance will be prohibitively high because liability would be unlimited. So that's where we need to be very careful as we move forward in this space. Thank you.
Thank you. That really are challenges for consideration. And Mark Tipping, how does Lloyd's and other classification and certification organizations influence or contribute to these changes? For example, how is Lloyd's Register developing rules where the nuclear code is the only reference, and does it mean rewriting certification?
Well, we look towards the past as our reference point when we're doing this. And it should be pointed out that whilst that code is very old, over 40 years old, it was written very well. So the changes, and I think the other speakers have articulated this very well, is the new technologies have changed things to actually make nuclear in maritime practical with that much smaller emergency planning zone. So we start by looking at actually what is this technology? And like with some of the groundbreaking offshore projects, is you start looking at the job to be done. And what's needed at this point in time is for people to put ideas forward. So the most helpful thing for a classification society is to have project proponents come to us and test ideas. Us test how we use the existing structures with the IMO, and Ricardo has referenced them very well, such as how we manage risk already. They already provide a lot of structure that we can start to use to look at projects, but those initial projects are key. And out of the work we've done now with looking at a range of these projects is we have developed what we're calling an integration framework for nuclear and maritime. And its job is to look at how we pull together the requirements of nuclear regulation and how we pull in the maritime regulation as well. Now, it will not be perfect. So the point is that we keep testing these ideas and we keep testing them with regulators so that we improve our knowledge to the point that we achieve enough consensus that we will be able to put these international regulations in place. And of course, for the very first projects, they'll probably move without existing regulation and have to base it on the risk-informed and risk-managed approaches, which have already provided an excellent framework for the other alternative fuels in the energy transition. But the important thing is to actually keep coming forward with projects to test the ideas to push this forward. Regulators themselves are not going to come up with regulation unless industry comes forward with ideas, projects and proposals on how the third-party assurance and the classification and the integration of regulation can be done. So we have to work collectively on that solution. And again, NEMO has been referenced a number of times today in that area. And I should just say that NEMO is a valuable resource for this, sitting between the International Atomic Energy Agency and the International Maritime Organization, with working groups looking specifically at regulation, insurance, legal aspects, and training, because the job's not done until all of these elements have been addressed.
Thank you. It's the usual catch-22, isn't it? Having to start to get something changed, but yet also not waiting to change before starting. Interesting. And Hermina, if I can turn to you to talk, to give your legal analysis on what needs to be considered when these international legal instruments are changing and what it means for nations, developers, and investors.
Thank you, Noreen. It's quite wide. I mean, if you take the nuclear sector by itself already, you have international conventions that apply in order to ensure non-proliferation, which is one of the major risks. So what is non-proliferation? Is the use, in fact, of nuclear material by states in order to develop nuclear weapons. Then you have the conventions that apply in order to ensure nuclear security. So what is nuclear security? It's in fact the theft, the use of nuclear material by non-governmental, in fact, entities in order to do also potentially weapons. Then you have the nuclear safety conventions that apply in order to ensure that there are no accidents. I mean, zero risk doesn't exist, but that's the aim that everybody has in the nuclear sector. It's safety first. After Chernobyl, you also had what we call the radiological conventions. So two conventions that apply. One is the notification convention, and the other one, I mean, that's the nicknames, let's say, notification convention. And the other one is the convention that allows countries to help each other when there is a nuclear accident. So that also, we will need to see how we apply to this. And finally, in some countries, you have environmental conventions that doesn't only apply to nuclear, but to any hazardous activities, by which, in fact, if you are developing an industrial activity that can have transboundary damage, it can damage the environment of a neighboring country, you have a consultation process that has to take place, not only within your state, but also with neighboring states. So for example, in Europe, so this is the ESPO convention that applies of environmental impact as international environmental impact assessment. And whenever a country wants, in fact, to build a nuclear reactor, they have to do a public consultation. There is no specific definition of what is the potentially affected state. So you can have, for example, Austria commenting projects in the UK or in Finland. So this is something like, for example, European countries, but also there are other countries that are also parties to this. We'll need to see how they would apply it. Of course, these are reactors, so nuclear reactors are included in the ESPO convention. Whether they're floating or not, it's not really specified. So we will need, in fact, to review all this. And of course, the most important one for the financial also sector is the nuclear third-party liability. As I was saying, the convention, the specific convention that was aimed to cover this area never came into force. As I mentioned also, I mean, we have the Lomonosov that is today operating in Russian waters. I mean, the risk here is that, yes, I mean, potentially a country can define all this from at a national level. If the floating nuclear power plant doesn't leave its national waters, that's the case in Russia. But however, what would happen in such a case is that if each country develop its own national framework, so the problem will be that floating nuclear power plants might not be treated the same in the different countries. So this will raise a lot of issues, like competition issues with the insurers also, because they reinsure each other and they like to have the same basis. And so and also the victims, the population. Why? I mean, in some countries maybe the legislation will be more stringent than in other. So it's extremely important to have an international legal framework, and for this we need to review this. But what is super interesting in this sector is that we have to do it hand in hand with the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, because also you have the IMO conventions that apply. So we have to see how all this will work together, in fact, with regard to these new technologies. And so that's also the challenge, where we need to learn from each other. For example, I had a meeting of the International Nuclear Law Association, my working group on nuclear liability, and invited some colleagues on financing ships to explain how ships are usually financed. And at the same time, they attended the meeting where we discussed nuclear and all the issues relating to floating nuclear power plants. And they said, "Oh, this is going to be interesting because we really need to learn from each other and to see how we're going to be able to finance." Because, for example, in the nuclear sector, in case there is a nuclear accident that causes nuclear damage, there's only one entity that is exclusively and strictly liable. It's the operator. So that means that no one else can be held liable, that the victims can only sue the operator, and that the victims don't need to prove fault. They only need to prove what we call the causal link between their damage and the accident. But who is the operator on a floating nuclear power plant? So we'll have to define who is the operator. Because the operator, according to these conventions, is any entity that the government might consider as such. So even in the nuclear power sector today, an operator is not only the licensee, the one that has the operating license, it could be also other entities. And it has been the case where you can have parent companies that also considered like operators. And also, so the relationship, which will be interesting, is the relationship between the captain and the one that's going to be in charge of the reactor. So because for us, the operator is the person in charge of the reactor. So that is also something that's going to be extremely interesting to discuss. And finally, the flag of the ship, we already mentioned that. But for us also, we will need to have clearly, I think from an international perspective, defined what is going to be the consequences of the flag of the ship, as we were discussing about the flag, for example, that the country of the flag needs to have the capacity to maybe authorize the floating nuclear power plants, but also to deal with the waste, to deal with the refueling. But if it's that, does it mean that maybe it will have to travel one country to another across, different maritime zones, like the high seas or other international waters? So then you get again into the problem of what happens if there is a nuclear accident during the course of that carriage. And then that is not answered because the current nuclear liability conventions are not applicable, because they provide that one operator for nuclear installation. So it's either the receiver or the sending operator that is going to be liable. But here, where is the operator?
Got it. So quite an extensive list of items to consider. So what we've done is we've looked at the existing rules. We've talked a little bit about what's changing, very much also about what needs to be considered. And now what brings it all together really is, perhaps for many of us, the underlying concern about carbon emissions, and that was very clearly addressed this year. I'm going to bring it to you, Ricardo, to tell us a little bit about if you could tell us what was discussed at the 110th session of the IMO's Safety Committee meeting that happened this June, mid-June, and what we should expect in October of this year as well. And just before you start, I should just kind of read out the fact that the nuclear code runs alongside the results of the work of the correspondence group on development of a safety regulatory framework to support the reduction of GHG emissions from ships using new technologies and alternative fuels. I picked a mouthful there. So that's the CG on GHG safety. So in the context of that, Ricardo, very briefly again, what is being anticipated as a change?
So very briefly, Doreen, in June, the Maritime Safety Committee has decided on which IMO bodies, subcommittees, concrete work to go ahead. It decided on which technologies would be further worked in the different subcommittees. So technologies such as carbon capture, nuclear, alternative fuels, from biofuels to revision of methanol guidelines and wind-assisted propulsion. So the safety framework for all these technologies has been allocated by the Maritime Safety Committee in June to the different subcommittees. Each subcommittee will have to develop a work plan and now work independently on developing the safety framework for these technologies. Very much, of course, the net zero greenhouse gas framework is expecting the decision on adoption now in the end of October. That is a separate work. Of course, these two are linked because all the safety framework is a facilitating element for technology uptake and for designs to include and integrate different technologies. I would say it is an important enabler, the safety framework, but as Mark already indicated, industry and designs are not expecting for these rules. They can also make through alternative design and risk-based design assessment. Of course, harmonization is intended through international regulatory framework, but these are not holding back investments in different specific technologies. However, there is a significant expectation about the voting now in end of October with respect to the net zero framework. These are inevitably linked together because economic viability of many of these technologies is linked with the carbon price, and it is obviated by a greenhouse gas framework which makes economic feasibilities for these technologies. However, we believe that there are other advantages in the different technologies on the table, not only the greenhouse gas mitigation, but others. Right now we moved from the decision of the Maritime Safety Committee to actual work on the ground to develop these different frameworks for the different technologies. Different subcommittees are now working on these specific elements.
Incredible. Clearly so much to consider there again. And two questions. The first is to Mark Smith. If you could just describe the insurance considerations for the development and operations of the FNPPs, these civil nuclear-powered commercial vessels to sail from port to port, bearing in mind the points that Hermine has just made.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very good point, that every country is going to treat this nuclear technology differently, and that's going to be perhaps a potential barrier as such. Port clearance is going to be a barrier to overcome for vessels, as we first discussed. There need to be consideration over nuclear handling waste as well. What about liability regimes for that? We discussed before pooling. We touched on it very lightly, and floating nuclear power plants in particular may be non-poolable. And speaking to people in the IG about this, it's maybe likened to an FPSO effectively, but the non-poolable cover makes it a little bit more tricky as such. We spoke about of a fixed value. And then obviously the most important things, is obviously from our perspective as well, is, the safety and the technological development of these platforms and this equipment effectively. We need to stay tuned with that. We need to work close with others across the industry, others that are on the call now, including classification societies, the IMO, and we need to all, take that as a very important and use that as a basis to form liability regimes as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mark. Talked about spent fuel. I've heard it picked up now a couple of times now. I should mention that just 4 months ago, when we convened in London at the New Nuclear Summit, a debate was had on whether we would even see modular nuclear technology operating before 2035. But just between that period, between April and this year, we've now had the USA's Department of Energy's announcement showing support for 11 advanced nuclear technology companies to test their reactors, with the aim of getting 3 operational by July 4th, 2026. And obviously, from a ship perspective, we've seen a developer of ships powered with nuclear, possibly looking at up to 90 different new nuclear reactor designs which are being developed. And it's been said that 9 of the 90 are aimed at the maritime market. So there's quite a bit of technology changes out there. But all of them come with some level of spent fuel. So Mark Tipping, let me put this to you. It's surely a challenge in certifying multiple technologies. Firstly, is there somewhat of a template that Lloyd's Register and you look at?
Yes, there is something of a template, and that is the way we look at new technology. New technology going into the maritime industries is nothing new. And there are well-trodden paths on how you assess the suitability of those technologies. And at Lloyd's Register, we're not only technology agnostic, we have to be technology agnostic. And anyone can put forward a design, but it then has to be tested through a qualification process with ourselves. But that's just with Lloyd's Register. Any reactor will also need to be licensed conventionally with a national state regulator as well, which is why we've developed the integration framework, because it pulls those various paths together. So it's easy to talk about it, but it's the actual hard work in doing that verification, which is where we really learn which reactors are going to be most suitable. I suspect you could make any of them work. The question is which ones are going to be economic in the space.
Okay, fantastic. Hermina, if I can give you the last comment on new nuclear technology and spent fuel, because obviously legislation has been observed, as you've rightly mentioned, for land-based spent fuel, and is being considered for maritime and FNPPs. So from a legal perspective, could you give us some of your thoughts on the impact that these issues raise?
I mean, from a financial perspective, it's a huge impact, because the first question the banks are going to ask you is, what are you going to do with the waste? Who is going to be in charge of the waste? Definitely, this is an ESG, requirement, and therefore we need to have again a relevant legal framework. There is the joint convention in the nuclear international legal framework that covers and governs all activities related to fuel and management of radioactive waste. And so we should try to see whether this convention, how is it going to be applied to the floating nuclear power plants. As mentioned, the thing is that either it's going to be the shipbuilder country that is going to take back potentially the radioactive waste, or is it going to be the country where the floating nuclear power plant is located? In such a case, that country definitely needs to have all the infrastructure and also the human resources to be able to deal with the waste, which is an issue in every country, even nuclear power countries. Now today, Finland is the first country to have constructed a deep geological repository, and then hopefully next will be France and Sweden. But these are now the kinds of installations that are needed in order to be able to store forever the radioactive waste. So are also those countries able to? I mean, there is a discussion also at the EU level. Some countries are small, some don't have so many nuclear installations as to have these deep geological repositories, which are extremely expensive and are fascinating. I don't know if you have seen the schematics of these installations, but it's just incredible. They go super deep in the earth. So yeah, it is an issue that when you're, and also when, for nuclear power reactors, you cannot develop a project without knowing what you're going to do with the waste.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
if you want to have floating nuclear power plant, you need to know even from the beginning what you're going to do with the waste.
That's right. From a financing perspective, what we tend to do is we look to make sure that there's a decommissioning facility, there's a waste, that there's financing for the spent fuel all up front. I always say it's like planning for those with kids going to college, that, you know, from the day they're born, you've got to start putting university fees aside.
Exactly that.
Yeah, indeed. There's just so much to say, and I wanted to also pick Mark Tipping's brains on what he's doing with digital twins, but I think we're going to have to do a separate webinar altogether on digital twins, because I think that's going to also fundamentally change the way we look at improving and changing regulation. The other thing, Ricardo, we were going to talk about what technologies we could expect from a revised IMO nuclear code, but perhaps if you want to do 15-20 seconds on that, but otherwise maybe we can do that after the October discussion. But I'll give you that chance to say something.
That's actually a 5-second reply. The nuclear code, it will be 99.9% likely technology agnostic and will not cover any specific technology, but will rather focus on safety performance.
Okay, very helpful. Fantastic. So let's maybe give everyone at least 15 to 20 seconds to have a final thought, anything that is a must consider at this point of time. First, starting with you, Ricardo, then the two Marks, and Hermina, I'll give you the last word.
My very quick last word is really to thank you, Doreen, for this initiative, and to thank also my colleague panelists. I believe that just to give you an overview, this week I've been in 3 meetings, 3 events on nuclear power for ships. We see momentum, and IMO Secretariat is preparing to support member states and organizations in the work ahead. Being part of these discussions for the IMO is key, and closer also to our sister agency IAEA, which will be involved in this work as well. So everyone on board, and I'm sure I will see each one of you very soon again on another event. Thank you, Doreen.
Brilliant. Thank you. Mark Tipping.
Again, likewise, thank you, Doreen, and thank you to my other panelists as well. I'm going to keep this simple with one thought. This is not about will the technology work and is the technology coming. This is about the regulation, the legal aspects, and the insurance and the training of people. These are the areas which require the greatest effort, along with societal engagement for acceptance. We're confident the engineering and the technology is on the right path.
Fantastic. Mark Smith.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks again. Much appreciated. I think the one thing, I think Mark's touched on it there, and I don't want to repeat too much what Mark's saying, but safety is paramount here. We need to assess the risk, we need to use industry collaboration to address the risk, and we need to put in place suitable liability regimes. To do that, we're going to rely heavily on other areas of the industry and technological advancements, not only in the machinery itself, but in the risk analysis of the forthcoming nuclear power technology. With that, I'd like to say thanks and wish you all a pleasant day ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Amina.
Well, it was a pleasure contributing to this webinar. Thank you so much, Doreen, and also the fellow panelists. As a lawyer, I have the final word. I mean, nothing can be done, sorry, without the legal framework. We do need to have a clear legal framework. And I also worked in an international organization at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. I was the head of legal for and was there for 11 years. And but you know, when there is a will, there is a way. You know, Batista explained how sometimes it all depends on the will of the countries to agree on something and go forward. So I'm sure that there is a lot of interest. A lot of countries are looking forward to have this kind of floating nuclear power plants. And so I'm very hopeful. And so I would just say, just let's do it, because as Mark was saying, technology is there.
Fantastic. And to everyone who's tuned in now and receiving it as a recorded conversation, it's very obvious that there is so much knowledge that firstly sits within our panelists that have been here on this webinar. Secondly, that there is so much that needs to be considered and discussed. Thirdly, there is optimism that is coming alongside all these discussions, well-needed differing opinions. And then the last thing I thought, for me, it was incredible that even the generative AI is already able to come up with an image of what could be a floating nuclear power plant or a ship or a nuclear propulsed ship. So clearly, you know, we're already in that future space. So I've left just to thank the panelists, the audience for being there, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.